a lot of your improvements will come through technical improvements anyways, so it's a lot less program reliant, and also with just generic beginner gains physiologically. Now, knowing that you're gonna get improvement anyways if the technique improves, knowing that you're gonna get improvement anyways because of beginner gains, your first couple of years is best spent trying to explore those different types of programming and schemes. Because even if some of those things don't work, some of the schemes don't work, some of the styles of programming doesn't work, you still have beginner gains to carry your gains. You still have technical improvements to carry it.
Howdy, howdy, team. Day two. Me and Dom are back at it. We just played around with some powerlifting, and that was a lot of fun. But we're going to spend a little bit of time mostly talking about programming today. Programming technique is what we want to spend most of today on. We had a look at technique already, so we're going to ask a few programming questions. I think one that's always really fun to start with is, let's say me and Alex walk in your door. We've obviously talked about this with the other interviews. You said that you like to do lots of different things in the first couple of years, but is there a place you like to start people? Are there templates? Are there programs? Like, if we both walk in the door and want to start with you, where would you start us and why?
So basically, yes, there will be templates initially. There has to be templates initially. The program, I don't care what coach you go with, like the program will not be specific initially. It shouldn't be, because they don't know your body. They don't know how you respond to training. What we were talking about yesterday was basically the first 1 to 2 years would be a lot of exploratory blocks. So a lot of training blocks that explore different types of training modalities, different types of schemes, rep schemes, set schemes, and different exposures to intensities, volume, and so on and so forth for the first couple of years, with the purpose of finding what works, doesn't work, and then obviously use that to make the program more and more specific and individualized over time. So to answer that specific question, yes, there will be templates, but the template is designed to explore. The template is designed to test those different schemes. It's not necessarily just designed to generate adaptation. If you're a beginner to powerlifting, I think we spoke about that yesterday, a lot of your improvements will come through technical improvements anyways, so it's a lot less program reliant. That's why you'll see a lot of beginners and novices improve, and also with just generic beginner gains physiologically. That's why you see a lot of beginners improve with kind of different types of programming, because their technique improves over the first year, right? Now, knowing that you're gonna get improvement anyways if the technique improves, knowing that you're gonna get improvement anyways because of beginner gains, then you're actually your first couple of years is best spent trying to explore those different types of programming and schemes. Because even if some of those things don't work, some of the schemes don't work, some of the styles of programming doesn't work, you still have beginner gains to carry your gains. You still have technical improvements to carry it. So a lot of my earlier training blocks would be around exploring those different schemes, and their efficacy for that specific individual.
Awesome. And how is this the same or different if you're coaching weightlifting? Obviously, we spent a lot of time looking at this yesterday. You said that there are certain kind of movement proficiencies you expect from a person before they do a full snatch or a full clean and jerk to competition standard. Assuming that they've kind of already hit that, is there still like an exploratory phase in weightlifting where you would do similar things? Or is it kind of like now that we've hit movement proficiency, actually things are a lot more the same and that's how things vary early on?
This is actually like a pretty good question. The Because it's different. The answer is different. So with weightlifting, even more so, will technical proficiency and technical improvements will carry you for a little bit longer, or actually a lot longer. So basically, your first 3 years of improvement is technique. right? And much less around the scheme, much less around different types of programming, in my opinion, right? Uh, I would say for me as a coach, one of the things that I'd have to accept is I have limited cognitive capacity, right? I have limited brain power, basically. I'm much better, I'd much rather spend my brain power trying to figure out how to improve the beginner weightlifter or like the novice weightlifter. I'd much rather spend my brain power improving their technique than trying to figure out what the best programming would be for them, right? Because again, like if I just apply pretty basic scheme and programming for weightlifting, but apply all my brain power in trying to figure out how to improve their technique, I'll probably get a lot more out of them for the first 3 years, and those technical improvements will carry them and carry their improvements early.
Awesome. So let's say that you've done a couple years of exploratory phases. We're talking about powerlifting now. You've got a little bit of information. How much do you think, as a powerlifter progresses, that information changes? So let's say you've been running them on month-long blocks so that we can keep track of time. And the second block in, you really found that sets of 8 on the high bar put their squat up something decent. Now, 2 years have passed. Their body's probably changed quite a lot. How much does that information still hold true within your experience 2 years later?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question too, because like I gave you the 2 year kind of arbitrary number of exploratory phase. I say arbitrary because it might be a lot shorter than that, anyways. Like if you figure it out quite quickly, like what this person responds to, but the assumption is that uh, because I'm guessing the assumption behind the question is that the athlete's body will change and um, their responsiveness to the stimulus would change. Is that what you're asking, right?
Potentially,
Yeah,
yes.
potentially. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, that's I suppose that word potentially is the important part, right? Like, so if it doesn't change, right, then you could pretty much assume that well, you work off the assumption that it hasn't changed yet, right? But you start with that, and then again, like from a programming standpoint, like you'll find out, after actually running not an exploratory block, but an actual competitive block where you're actually trying to apply what you thought had worked over the years. But if it doesn't work, maybe also the next question is like, yes, did the athlete's responsiveness to that stimulus change, or um, was my assessment of the training block incorrect, right? So let's say my first initial assessment, like you said, is that like the high bar eights worked for that block, and then I ran it 2 years later and it didn't work. Was it just that I assessed incorrectly? It wasn't the high bar eights that worked, it was something else in that program that worked. Or again, like your assessment might be true, where it's like the athletes athlete's body has changed, their strengths and their weaknesses has changed, and also and that stimulus doesn't work anymore, and that's fine too. And again, like that culture of change, that culture of evolution, right? Like essentially, um, you'll have just another block where you're like, oh, actually, we tried that, didn't work. Okay, let's try something else. Like it's not like a failure, so to speak. It's just like a process of trying and did it work? Did it not work? Yeah.
Ah, cool. That's definitely a good point to make. I guess another question I definitely have is, with the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, are there any through lines that you really think exist independent of most lifters? Like there are some coaches that will just say, high bar eights, going back to that example, generally work for people most of the time, and there'll be exceptions to this rule, but largely that's where I would start. Are there any kind of recipes or programs that you tend to see work more across the board, generally speaking, with a squat, a bench, or a deadlift? Or are there any things that you really like starting with because they're pretty high percentage in general?
Okay. I think I understand the question, right? Like, um,
Well, like going back to before, you were like, okay, you're a relatively technical like bencher. You don't have much more technical proficiency to learn,
Mhm.
so you just need to be a bigger and stronger boy. Like that's a general assumption that you've made about bench pressing. If you're bigger and stronger in the upper body, you're going to press more. Totally fair assumption, by the way. It's not crazy at all. But like, I'm wondering if there are other general assumptions that you make about squatting, deadlifting, and bench pressing that you would start with to give people a better chance of actually progressing from the outset.
Yeah, so to start with, uh, you don't really want to get too far away from what's tried and true and that's been spoken about in the industry already or in the community already, which is let's start with like the basic uh, with the basic split creation, right? So you're looking at frequency. To start with, you probably don't want to get too far away from squatting 2 times a week. You don't want to get too crazy and start squatting 3, 4 times a week. Like start with two. With benching, I know again, like it's very much so pushed in the community to bench high frequency, especially for women. Benching 5 times a week or whatever. It's very much so pushed now because that's what the higher level athletes do. But I would start at three. In deadlift, I would start at 1.5, right? So might be a situation where every fortnight you'll deadlift twice, every every fortnight you're only deadlifting once, or it might be like a moderate to high stimulus 1 time a week, and then a very very low stimulus the second deadlift. So when it comes to schemes, I wouldn't get too far away from anywhere between 4 to 6 reps for a lot of people. If you start getting to 3 rep range and lower, you're looking at crazy amounts of sets, perhaps for like what a beginner would have to do or like a novice. Really, if you're doing triples, like you don't really want to do much less sets than 5, which that's 15 total working reps. It starts to get pretty skinny there on the reps. And yeah, I wouldn't go too far away from 4 to 6 reps initially. And if you're following that from a programming standpoint early, very rarely you'll go wrong. Like I said, like again, squat twice, deadlift 1.5 times a week, bench 3 times, 4 to 6 reps, train moderately, and if you improve your technique early, it'll take you a very very long way.
Awesome. And I guess like another thing that's very interesting is these days people talk a lot about leverages and stuff like that. How much do you see leverages kind of impacting the personalization of programs over time? You know, some people might have really long femur and a really long torso, and that's going to obviously potentially put more stress in certain places and vice versa. When you meet an athlete or you're looking at these exploratory blocks, how much do you actually consider like limb lengths and leverages and stuff like that by default, versus how much do you just let the program do its thing and see how they respond?
I would let the I would let the lever just dictate the positions in the movements. Okay, and then with the positions, then I would then let it dictate the builders more so than anything. So the accessories. So people like to call it accessories. I like to call it builders, because accessories sound like it's something extra, and then people can kind of justify skipping it a lot of the time. So I like to call it builders because it actually builds the main lifts. Um, so in terms of schemes, right? I know sometimes some people say it's like, oh well, from a programming standpoint, this person's range of motion on the bench because of their levers is so short. Maybe I'll like bench them 5 times a week because they're. Yes, that can be a consideration, but the levers dictate the position. The position then dictates what parts of or what individual joint actions and individual muscles need to be programmed through the builders. Um, so if you have a very like if I see someone and I believe that their deadlift has to be more hingy, more hip dominant, then that means that a lot of the builders would have to be more hinge and hip dominant, building that joint action, the muscles around that joint action more than anything. Not so much change in terms of frequency, not so much change in terms of intensities or anything like that. Like my first initial intervention would be through the builders.
Awesome. And I guess something that we've talked about a lot over the last week is the fact that you really take a long term stance to developing athletes. You know, they might be here 5, 10 years in your mind when you're dealing with people. And you've also said that you really, in terms of technique and everything, you have no problems giving people much closer grip bench or something like that because that's going to create and provide the muscle long term that they need to be as strong as possible. One thing I'd find really interesting to hear about is, does that ever lead you to a place where you might actually give people builders before main lifts? Have you ever done anything like that? Is that something you experiment with, or no, not at all?
No, no. So I still prioritize the main lifts. The only thing that I would put before the main lifts would be more like warm up movements, whether it be mobility or activation drills, like stuff that will work long term. So like let's take for example just like glute development, right? Like unilateral glute bridge, right? I would consider that more of an activation drill more than anything. I do that before, like any kind of rotator shoulder work. I did that before the bench press. Um, just because a lot of people, again, like they have a tendency from a behavioral standpoint, they have the tendency to skip that stuff because they don't see a lot of benefit to it short term, but those things work long term, in my opinion, right? So doing them before the main lifts gives them the idea that, hey, I'm warming up the joint action, which they are. It's not a lie. They are, but also a lot of that is because like the efficacy of this, or the effectiveness of this, you can't see until much long term. So let's prioritize this now. Lower RP. It's going to be a warm up anyway, so we make sure that it doesn't get skipped at all. Um, I put the core work, for example, at the very end, which can be considered like kind of like that long term, but also um, again, like we still want to prioritize the main lifts, right? I don't want to do a bunch of heavy back extensions before like doing deadlifts, because then you'll fatigue like that very specific area. And yeah, I'd still pretty much arrange training very traditionally that way.
No, awesome. And I think something that we touched on a fair bit today was injury. I'd really love to hear kind of what your stance is on programming around injury, or if there are things that are kind of not quite going to plan. How much do you try to stick to a program? How much do you try to change a program? I'd really love to hear what you have to think about that.
I think injury is a part of the sport, right? Like if you're doing, well, part of not the sport, any sport, right? I think if you're doing any sport, you're gonna get injured. It's like trying to go into boxing and expecting not to get punched in the head, right? Like you're gonna get punched in the head. You don't want to. You want to do everything you can to avoid it, and you're gonna do everything you can in training to avoid it. So it's the same thing here in terms of training. We're gonna do everything we can to achieve a symmetrical body, because it's a symmetrical sport, right? That one thing that like a lot of physios would want to do, like achieve a symmetrical position, because it is a symmetrical sport. But God doesn't build in straight lines, so you're gonna have to do a lot of that work. Um, in terms of injury prevention, I think is like you try to aspire to that for that to that aspire towards that. Yeah, aspire towards that as a coach, but really you can only do so much in a sport that exposes your body in extreme positions at extreme loads. It's gonna happen. It's gonna be a part of it. In terms of uh, programming, planning for it, that's kind of how I do it. I would plan to work those specific joint actions that are weak, so that, or like culprits, I would say, like your typical culprits, your rotator cuffs, your weak glutes, your weak core. I'd prescribe a lot of preventative stuff, albeit like very generic, right? Like um, just in anticipation of kind of pain that might be caused by dysfunction in that area. And that's like just through experience in the sport. But in terms of adjustments when the injury has already occurred, um, it's really hard to speak on it very generically, because it has to be, um, yeah, case by case. What I would say is you gotta also understand when it's an injury, when it's pain, when it's niggle. You gotta understand that. You gotta understand when something that can be fixed by a couple of days rests extra. when pain is caused because of accumulated fatigue, kind of like what we talked about peaking and having those extra niggles around peak week, right? You got to understand what pain is good pain, what pain should be attended to, what pain is something that you can um, fix or remedy just by resting that movement for 3 to 4 days, and what pain it has to have a complete overhaul of movement pattern. So again, like that's a very very specific uh, answer that you probably need. Um, but I have to give a generic answer in this situation.
Totally understandable. And I guess another one that's really fun to talk about is getting to the pointy end. It's near a competition. You've now got a peaking block. Everyone kind of likes to taper and peak a little bit differently. What are your general thoughts on peaking and tapering? I mean, we're talking a little bit about it before, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on camera.
Um, so essentially, like in terms of like a traditional view of peaking and tapering, basically what you'll see is as training goes on in a block, you'll accumulate fatigue, right? As you accumulate fatigue, you'll accumulate strength too, or you accumulate fitness, right? And then, but what you accumulate once you accumulate your fatigue, your ability to display your strength or your ability to display your fitness starts to drop towards the very end. And that's kind of where you see peaking, right? You start feeling weaker, right? Even though you know that you've trained for 10, 12 weeks, you know that you've accumulated strength, but towards the end, you're feeling weaker because the accumulated fatigue is so great, right? And then what you do is then taper. And typically, traditionally in powerlifting, the taper will look something along the lines of 3-day taper for bench, 5-day taper for squats, 7-day taper for deadlift, and then a more advanced one would be like a 5-day taper for bench, 7 days for squats, and 10 days for deadlifts. And this is like talking super generic, right? Like that's where you'd start. And basically, what the taper aims to do is to reduce all those accumulated fatigue or remove all those accumulated fatigue in the short term. And then you've accumulated your strength, and then your ability to display strength then spikes. Now, what that looks like in real life is basically a situation where perhaps the week before the competition, you've accumulated so much fatigue that you've got a lot of niggles. You have basically a limited, very, very limited ability to display your strength. And you have a situation where the athlete is what I like to refer to as like cooked. You're just cooked. You're super cooked at the moment. And what do you do when you cook a steak? You let it sit like for a little while, and that's what you need to do. You just need to let them sit on that last week, perhaps, right? So that's what our typical peak and taper would look like. Low and slow, essentially. Like fry them towards the very end. They're cooked, all right, and then they should feel pre-taxed. They should feel not their strongest, but their weakest, which mentally can play with their heads a little bit. Okay. Um, and then let them sit, and then the fatigue will dissipate, the niggles will dissipate, and then you compete.
How much do you tend to see individualization playing a part in something like a taper and a peak? Are you happy playing relatively similar things across the board? Do you see that people need very, very different peaks and tapers, or are you pretty happy running something quite similar in general?
As far as programming is concerned, it'd be like the same kind of answer to programming. Initially, you'll have to start generic with your peak. Like you won't know how this person peaks specifically. Even much later in their careers, let's say 3 4 years, like you won't know exactly, right? Um, so yeah, I'd start very generic with those 3 days, 5 days guides that I just gave, and then over time you'll get to know better, in terms of how much volume to remove, how much intensity to remove, or maybe you don't, maybe you keep the intensity all the way up, um, but that becomes very very individual, very very late. Okay, but initially follow the rules. That's how I would see that. um, Also, initially, kind of going back to that peaking, uh, probably in terms of cooking someone, to what extent, like when they're new, probably you probably mess with them too much mentally if you like absolutely cook them like 1 week out and they're like super duper weak. So that's probably more reserved for like the more intermediate lifters. Yeah, you probably don't want to see like a novice or a beginner lifter absolutely fried, feeling niggles here and there on their first year of competing. You kind of just want to have like a more conservative kind of peak there too.
And do you think this changes a lot, powerlifting to weightlifting? Obviously, powerlifting, you've got a lot of heavy lifting. There's a lot going on. Less total load in a weightlifting scenario. Do you think that tapering looks similar, different? How so?
It looks different. So you'll have different schools of thoughts. My read on the newest schools of thought in weightlifting right now is that because weightlifting is a technical sport, they want to keep technical proficiency and sharpness as late as they can in the program. So you might literally find someone training 24 hours before the competition. Might just be bar, might just be muscle snatches or light powers, or it might be fulls, depend on uh, the coaching philosophy. And then you'll have some old school coaches that will just tell people to like not do anything for like the last week or do barely anything for the last week. Um, but a lot of the new schools of thoughts in the community right now is to keep them training all the way up to 24 hours before. You just drop the loads, perhaps. So you'll see frequency go, you'll see volume go, uh, but you'll keep. Sorry, not frequency. You'll see intensity go, and then you'll see the volume go, but you'll keep the frequency as late as 24 hours before competition.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really all that we wanted to ask you today. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Joel, and thank you for flying all the way over from Perth to go see us, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of your holidays.